Hello and welcome to our webinar series, Next Steps in COVID-19 Response in Long-Term Care. My name is Tanya McDonald, Director of Innovation and Strategic Development here at Healthcare Excellence Canada, and I'm pleased to be your host for today's webinar. Donc, bonjour et bienvenue à tous. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples since the beginning. In particular, we acknowledge that we are broadcasting this webinar from Ottawa, Ontario, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place and the opportunity to gather here today. And thank you also for joining us on this journey where we can shape the future of quality and safety of healthcare together. So today we are pleased to bring you a full program of information, lived experiences, and tools that you can utilize in your organizations. We will share HEC's evaluation results from the Long-Term Care Plus Acting on Pandemic Learning Together program, which has run from July 2020 to March 31st, 2022. Learn about a new framework for managing health human resources, and discuss some of the creative ways that long-term care homes have approached models of staffing during the pandemic. We are pleased to offer French simultaneous interpretation for this session. If you wish to hear the voice of the interpreter, please select French from the interpretation menu at the bottom of your screen. We invite you to share your questions and comments at any point using the chat box in either English or French, and we encourage all of you to respond to each other's comments and answers in the questions in the chat as well. We will aim to connect as many of your questions as we can with our speakers during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If you need support at any time during this webinar, please reach out to tech support using the chat feature in Zoom. And this session is being recorded and will be available on our website in the next couple of days to review or share with your colleagues who have missed it. At this time, I am pleased to introduce Justin Liu, Evaluation Lead at Healthcare Excellence Canada, to share a brief summary of the evaluation of our Long-Term Care Plus program. Many of you participated in one or more of our program offerings and have shared your feedback. Your responses are important as they will help us to evolve our programming to be relevant and impactful in the long-term care context. So over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Tanya. And thanks to all of you in the webinar who participated in LTC Plus and responded to our final survey. Your responses help us continually improve our programs, and I'm pleased to be here today to share the results with you. In total, we received 245 survey responses across 4 iterations of the final survey. The first one was open during February and March 2021, and the most recent iteration closed in March of this year. Next slide, please. LTC Plus participants varied greatly in their context and needs, and in turn reported a wide range of ways in which LTC Plus contributed to their pandemic response, with impacts at the organizational level and impacts on the intended beneficiaries living and working in the homes. The first 4 themes cover organizational impacts, and the last one outlines the impacts on the people. So LTC Plus increased organizations' access to resources and knowledge. Participants reported that the funding and information enabled them to purchase PPE and supplies, hire staff, acquire technology for recreational programming and virtual care, and provide training. LTC Plus support also helped teams implement practices and policies for their pandemic response. 85% reported that LTC Plus increased their capacity to implement the promising practices outlined in the Reimagining Care for Older Adults report. And 55% reported having made changes to policies, standards, or guidelines using information from LTC Plus. The program helped give participants a sense of preparedness and reassurance in facing the pandemic. 78% reported that the program helped them prepare for possible future outbreaks and mitigate their effects. This sense of reassurance came from pandemic planning, improved knowledge and attitudes among staff, and the connections to the support network of other long-term care and retirement homes in the LTC Plus program. And this network was another impactful aspect of the program. Participants valued this peer-to-peer knowledge sharing in the huddles and the group coaching that were offered, which allowed them to learn what others were doing across Canada, share ideas, and gauge their own pandemic plans. And finally, participants reported the ways in which they were better able to support their staff, residents, and families. Infection prevention and control measures they implemented helped keep staff and residents safe from COVID-19. And some reported communication improvements across the care team and improved practices for engaging all stakeholders. LTC Plus guided them through approaches to better support the mental health and well-being of staff, residents, and families. And many noted the guidance in particular for reintegrating essential care partners and other approaches to prioritize person-centered care. Next slide, please. So this slide shows some of the outcomes for these people living and working in the homes. Over half the respondents reported improvements in resident and family experience of care, the health of residents, the work life of healthcare providers, and the efficiency of care. Next slide, please. And finally, in the most recent 2 iterations of the survey, we included some questions to help steer the directions we take for future programming for the sector. I'll share these results with you very quickly and also invite you to reach out to us, whether it's in this chat or by email, if you have any other feedback to help shape our future programming. We know that funding is a valuable support, but of the other offerings that we had provided, most expressed continued interest in joining webinars just like this one. Just over half would be interested in the half-hour huddles for collaboration and knowledge sharing, and 41% would be interested in coaching from a quality improvement coach. Next slide, please. Of those interested in coaching, and coaching is offered as part of our current LTC QI program, most would prefer a group format rather than one-on-one. Most would prefer being grouped with others in their province and territory rather than across Canada. And most would prefer a pre-planned schedule of topics rather than flexible topics selected as teams go. Next slide, please. And I recognize that the text on this slide is small and difficult to read. I'll talk through the options on the side for you, and we can provide the slides to you by email afterwards. Overall, there was most interest expressed in training on leadership in the sector, followed by a general program on a variety of topics, similar to LTC Plus. A program spoke like LTC Plus, but focused specifically on person-centered care in particular, trainings on quality improvement, and we did offer some QI trainings a couple weeks ago, and we'll continue to offer these, and a program focused on supporting people in the workforce. And as this is the focus of today's webinar, I can't think of a better segue than this, so I'll turn it back over to Tanya. But again, we invite your and value your continued engagement and input to guide the design of our future programming.
Thank you so much, Justin, and echoing Justin's thanks to everyone who's completed the evaluation surveys as part of our program evaluation along the way to help us ensure we're being responsive to needs and also to help us inform future programming. So thank you so much, Justin. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the first part of today's webinar, where we will be discussing the development of an innovative staffing framework. So joining us today are Michelle Lowe. Michelle Lowe is the Executive Director of the Nursing Homes Association of Nova Scotia, where she advocates on behalf of 85% of nursing home administrators in Nova Scotia. She has held several executive roles in the continuing care sector over the past 25 years. Michelle represents members on a variety of sector tables, including as a member of the board for the Canadian Association of Long-Term Care. She holds an undergraduate degree in public relations from Mount St. Vincent University and an MBA from Sobey School of Business, St. Mary's University. Deborah Boudreau will also be speaking today. Deborah is an occupational therapist who has worked in acute care, home care, government, and currently long-term care. She is the CEO administrator of Tideview Terrace Nursing Home in Digmead, Nova Scotia, the first registered Eden Alternative Facility in Atlantic Canada, and the past chair of both the Nursing Homes of Nova Scotia Association and the Health Association of Nova Scotia Continuing Care Council. So Michelle and Deborah, over to you.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. Hi, everyone. So we're going to start with this one particular slide, avoiding bed closures in Nova Scotia long-term care. And I'm going to just quickly frame up the context of why we launched this particular project so that you'll certainly understand the context behind it. Can I have the next slide, please? So in this time last year in 2021, and certainly prior to the pandemic, you know, we were no different in Nova Scotia than I know in many cases across the country that workforce pressures have been ongoing in long-term care. And many of you, including ourselves, have certainly raised the alarm bells with our funders and decision makers over the last 5 to 10 years about this impending challenge that we were going to see with workforce pressures. And so, of course, the pandemic really raised the alarm bells and shone the spotlight on the vacancies and the challenges that we were experiencing. This time last year, administrators, long-term care team leaders were looking at scheduling for summer vacations, having gone through a very significant year of COVID and the impact, and realizing very quickly that they were running into some significant challenges in trying to fill those schedules, and knowing that their staff rightly deserved to have time off from the workplace. And so in my role, and as Deborah, our past board chair, we communicated back and forth around the alarming conversations that I was having with administrators who were sharing their absolute frustration around what to do, and felt very much as though they were alone. And they needed to be able to have something that could articulate better than what they were articulating to the ministry on really what this impact was having on the level of care, the quality of care for residents in Nova Scotia. This particular slide are just two of the many media reports that were taking place during that period of time. There were a lot of conversations in the media around workforce pressures, and these were just two of them, around staff shortages and closing admissions. And that was something that was never really even an option up until now. The other thing was, of course, the crisis in long-term care with staffing. So these were certainly many conversations that were taking place. Can I have the next slide, please? So we decided to engage a facilitator who was very familiar with lean practices and also within the healthcare sector. We brought together two of the other associations and organizations in Nova Scotia to really look at a very broad sector-wide impact if we could try to create a solution. And our approach has always been within our nursing home association that rather than, you know, go to government, go to decision makers and funders with the problems, we always go with the solutions in hand to fix the problems, or at least try to address them in some meaningful way. So this was our attempt to do that. So if you look at this particular slide, you will see that there's a very interesting diagram there that we wanted to be able to capture what were those big factors that were contributing to the decision for an administrator to really seriously look at having to close admissions for the summer in many cases. And what we discovered was that there were 6 real key areas, and perhaps we'll go to the next slide so that you'll be able to see them clearer. Okay, so we were looking at existing staff absences, government policies, working conditions, the workload, and of course, the work environment and the scheduling. So when you look at this, there were elements within each one of those buckets. So it talks about, you know, we had an older workforce. We had staff who were willing to work overtime, but they had been maxed out with, their amount of time that they could provide. If we look at the fact we had part-time staff within Nova Scotia who were unwilling to commit to certain schedules, our staffing models were different and hadn't been updated. When we look at the amount of staff who were unable to get time off under our working conditions, we had stories emerging of staff who were literally quitting their jobs because they wanted to be able to get their 2 weeks of vacation rather than being mandated to come in, and knew that they could be rehired after the vacation was over. These were certainly some of the factors that contributed to creating a framework that would really help to establish what this impact was having. So if you look at some of the other, I'm going to go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Great. So if we look at below that line, the scheduling, the shortage of staff, supply in the community, and the workload, there were even additional contributing factors. One of the things that we had noticed was that we were losing staff to the acute care sector. In our province, there were roles that within acute care that would be very comparable to long-term care, yet staff were going to work in acute care because they had higher wages. And so that was becoming very difficult. And it wasn't just on the frontline staff. This was certainly our senior leadership team. We're also having staff go to some of these manager positions within acute care. And we were looking at really decrease the amount of enrollment and offering of programs for our frontline staff. In Nova Scotia, we saw a significant decline in the enrollment with our community college for the CCA program that we offer, and these would be equivalent to healthcare staff that many of you might have in other long-term care sites. So these were key roles where we were just not seeing the level of graduates coming from these programs. So I'm going to pass this along now to my colleague, Deborah, to pick up from these factors that we had identified. So we'll go to the next slide, please.
Thank you, Michelle. So once we completed that root cause analysis and identified some of the contributing factors to the challenges that we were having with our staffing, we moved on to say, well, what can we do about it? And one of the things that as administrators, we had articulated, we really didn't have good language to share some of the things that we were seeing happening under our roofs every day. And so we came up with this framework to really help kind of guide that conversation, whether it was internally with our managers and leadership team and staff, or with the government or the funders, or folks that are our partners. So in our case, it could be, the placement office and the folks driving those processes. And so we approached it from the stoplight framework, a green, yellow, or red. You'll see the red in a moment. We didn't spend a lot of time in the green, in the steady state, where it's really about normal operations. We see those days on occasion, but not very often, it seems, these days. And so we spent a lot of time trying to articulate, what does a challenge state look like? And this in no means is intended that every bullet gets checked. It's not a tick off every checklist here. But when, as an administrator, as a leadership team, you're starting to see some of these elements come forward, it was really intended to prompt that, hey, something is wonky. We need to pay attention and put some mitigating factors in place, or, something's going to be happening worse and worse and worse as the days go by. So things like, not having enough RN coverage. Maybe in this state, you still have LPNs as backup. Similarly, you're seeing some shortages in your unregulated professionals, or your unregulated workers. We call them CCAs here in Nova Scotia. But you've got someone to backfill them, maybe your support workers environment. You're struggling to meet your licensing requirements was another indicator. Maybe you have a high level of RN graduates, so they can't work independently without another RN in the building. So that's challenging from a staffing perspective. You might see that your LPNs are taking charge because you don't have RNs. You're pulling from nights to cover your days. You're denying vacations. You're seeing your overtime grow. You're pulling staff from some consistent units off onto other units that they're not familiar working with. Maybe you've got some vacancies in your allied health, and we know, there might just be a handful of those individuals, but they have a significant gap when they're not in the building. You're seeing this more often than not, so 1, 2, 3 times a week, and so on and so forth. I won't go through everyone just for the sake of time, but it gives you a little flavor of what are some of the things that would prompt someone to then want to look more closely into what's going on and try to see, is this a trend? Is it a one-off? Is this happening every weekend? Is this happening, somewhat frequently? The other thing that we look to was the literature to say, well, what might be happening in our resident population while we're dealing with staff shortages. And so what the research told us is anything that you can expect from a resident indicator, you will see when there are staff shortages. Now, in this state, we thought, well, maybe you're just kind of on the cusp. And so you're starting to see changes in weight loss, dehydration, pressure ulcers, et cetera, but they're unexplained. You can't really put your finger onto why that's necessarily happening, but something's starting to happen. Next slide. And so then, as time goes on, if things haven't corrected themselves, then potentially you're sliding in this direction of a critical state. And what we did with our sector here in Nova Scotia, as we were presented this framework, we did a poll and we said, where do you see yourself? This week, 2 months ago, at various stages, and people could really kind of bite into this and articulate whether or not they saw themselves in a challenge state or a critical state, and some actually were in a steady state. So the critical state essentially mirrors a lot of the bullets that we pulled in the challenge state, but they're kind of the one-off, the even worse, like that next step on the scale. So the home is persistently not having enough RN coverage, and they're also having challenges with their unregulated health workers as well, as opposed to one or the other. There is no backfill, there is no RN or LPN to cover the charge position. Your directors of care, or if your RN is your administrator is an RN, they may be pulled to the floor. Sorry, I'm seeing what does LTCA? This is something that happened during COVID. They're kind of the 4th level worker, and in some cases they would be your environmental support worker or dietary aid that were pulled in to fill those vacancies. And then the list goes on. You're actually canceling vacations at this point, not just denying them. There is no resolution date to your staffing challenges. You're having difficulty filling sick calls more often, et cetera. And now from a client perspective, you might actually be able to say there's a direct impact with your lack of staff and these changes in resident status. Next slide. And so then we started looking at, well, what can we do when we find ourselves in these various states? And again, I won't go through each and every bullet, but it was really to try to get administrators to start thinking about not just closing beds, that jump to the, thou shalt never. But before we get to that point, and in order to be supported at the ministry level or the government level, if we were able to do multiple things on these lists, then the probability of being supported when we actually had to say it is time to close beds because we cannot support another admission and continue to provide safe care. So we'll just jump to the next slide, and I'll just pause on this one. We did look at some mitigation strategies, not just from the resident perspective, but what else could we do on a supply level or an infrastructure level, or various changes within the workplace itself. And we'll move to the next slide, and I'll hand it back to Michelle.
Great, thank you, Deborah. So we presented this framework to administrators after we completed in September. Many of them used this as a guide, as Deborah says, to look at what they were implementing as mitigating strategies, so that when they did reach out to the ministry, they could concretely show all of the strategies they had put in place, what was working, what was not. And there certainly appeared to be more of a readiness to work with those particular nursing homes and put a pause on admissions. So where we are now, we've had 39 long-term care facilities in Nova Scotia that were dealing with outbreaks this past winter. And we have, during that period of time, we've had admissions stopped in over 50 facilities on and off. Some of them were only for a very short period of time, maybe a week, but we've had some of those facilities that have chronically remained closed to any new admissions. And certainly it's about providing safe care for the residents that they currently take care of and not being able to take further admissions. But our ministry, of course, is still trying to work with them, go through the strategies. What are you doing? What can we do that's differently? So this really gave us an opportunity to be able to look at an approach that would really help to articulate the concern that we have. We, of course, are one of the, we call ourselves a bit of a unicorn here in long-term care in Nova Scotia, in that we have a new government that also came into power over the last 10 months. And part of their commitment has been reinvesting into long-term care. And so what we're seeing is new dollars in terms of new buildings, new beds. The challenge remains, how do we fill and support those new beds when we still have these ongoing workforce pressures? And again, we continue to use this framework to help with our decision making. So that's essentially what we have in Nova Scotia as a framework. And as I said, we've been very successful in terms of articulating the challenge to our decision makers and funders. So not sure if we have any questions that people might have. The final, this was the Value Collaborative is the name of the organization that we worked with very closely to help frame up the proposal for our government. We did present it to the department and to our ministry so that they could see, what the sector had been working on. So we certainly wanted to be very transparent with that as well. So that's the end of our presentation.
That's great, Michelle and Deborah. So we do have a few questions coming in. Actually, they're coming in furiously now. You stopped speaking, of course, which is always the way. And I was jotting a few down myself. So before we jump into the question period, which is some questions around your financing, satisfaction strategies, and so on, we will pass over to Lori Cirquetti. So Lori is a proud registered nurse in the 28th year of her career and passionate about long-term care. She has worked in various roles in long-term care for most of her career. For the last 10 years, she has worked as a CEO for a nonprofit faith-based personal care home. She is currently CEO at the Sal and Clarabelle Simpkins Center in Winnipeg, Manitoba, with a vision of a personal care home being a place of joy for those who live, work, and visit. So over to you, Lori, and then we will take an open question period with both presenters today.
Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in Canada. Thank you to Healthcare Excellence Canada for inviting me to share some of our journey with everyone today. Preparing for this presentation did give me a lot of time to reflect on what we've been through for the last couple of years, and a lot of what I'm going to share with you today is from the heart, and at some point I may get a little teary and you may as well. Next slide, please. So really I had to think back, because really the story starts prior to the pandemic, and we had a really good, strong relationship with all of our staff. Staff were engaged, we tried to provide a fun environment, and we always made an effort to ensure that all 3 shifts felt a part of the team and appreciated. Next slide, please. So pandemic planning was incredibly important. In Manitoba, we actually did have the benefit that we weren't hit hard by the first wave at all. So we had a lot of time, or more time, to prepare and really think about things and watch what was happening in other jurisdictions. And one of the things that we saw happening, not just in Canada, but around the world, that it was key that residents were fed and hydrated. So that was really always in the back of our minds when we were creating our pandemic plan. For our site, creating a COVID isolation unit was also key. Not every site could do this, but we felt this was what was best for us. And we asked for staff volunteers to work in this area. They were 12-hour shifts. We made sure that we took really great care of the staff that stepped forward to volunteer. We provided all of their food while they were here. We provided laundry service for them if they wanted. We made sure we had top of the line toiletries available to them. We also were quite relentless in our procurement of equipment and supplies. And this, we went kind of beyond our normal channels of trying to secure supplies. And this included everything from masks to shields to gowns to foggers to sprayers to UVC chambers, specialty mattresses, overbed tables, all of the things that were really hard to come by during the pandemic, or the beginnings of the pandemic anyways. We did a lot of preparing our staff and a lot of what I will call relentless truth telling. We were always really honest with them and made them aware of how bad it really could get and what they may be facing. We did develop a work short plan or a reduction in service plan. Communication with families, with our community and our staff was always timely, transparent, and truthful. And we always thought that, and still believe that, it's important that people hear these things from us, not from the media. And our plan is always evolving. From every outbreak that we encounter, there's always a learning, and the plan changes. Next slide, please. So really, I started to think about, why do staff come to work? And I think one of the reasons that they came to work here is because they felt safe. They felt supported. They knew that we had the equipment and supplies that were required to be able to do the job. It was also important in the first couple of outbreaks that we had the COVID isolation unit. And this was a unit where we actually took residents that were testing positive for COVID and moved them to a totally separate area that was manned by the staff that had volunteered to work in that unit and only in that unit. So the staff on the units felt safer. Our staff were very committed and loyal to the organization. I think it was also key that leadership was always present. There was no option for any of the leadership team to work from home. We were all very hands-on, and here we needed to make sure that staff knew we were here to support them, and that also, if we weren't at work, why would they come to work? So we wanted to make sure that we had a good presence. And again, the relentless truth telling, they knew what to expect. And we made a lot of efforts to make sure that staff felt appreciated. And I'll speak a little bit more to that later. Next slide, please. So we really had to think about who can help and how they can help. We realized very quickly in our first outbreak that we were pretty much on our own. And even though that there were efforts for a provincial relief team where we possibly could have gotten staff from, because of the magnitude of the outbreaks across our province, we were basically on our own. And we really had to balance the risks and benefits of who we could bring in to help us. Next slide, please. So obviously our staff would be there to help us, and we made sure very early on in the pandemic that every single person that worked at the Simpkin Center was able to assist with meals, going back to the whole principle of we need to make sure that residents are fed and hydrated. So the picture you see there is actually one of our maintenance personnel practicing feeding with our chief financial officer. So that's how far it went. Every single person here was able to assist if needed. It was always hands on deck for everything. And that could be emptying garbages. It could be setting up the isolation unit. It could be when we're having to put extra garbages and gowns on the units, anything like that. It was everybody participated, no matter your position in the organization. Again, I believe that the COVID isolation unit for our first 2 outbreaks was a really great option. And again, we had volunteers and they were 12-hour shifts. Once Omicron hit over Christmas and New Year's here at the Simpkin Center, it was fast and furious. And we lost more staff in 1 week than we did in 7 weeks of our first outbreak. So it was just we really struggled. And one of the things that we found helped is we posted the schedules on the wall in the staffing office area, and staff were able to view which shifts were vacant. We circled them all, and staff would just volunteer to pick shifts up. And they would also take pictures of the vacant shifts and send them to their other colleagues to encourage them to pick up shifts as well. So it was kind of a way of peer pressure, encouraging your colleagues to assist you. So that actually did work really well. There were periods where we would definitely have reduced staffing and things were critical, but that also meant a reduced workload. And we were very clear with our staff what that could possibly look like. And we were very clear with our families and community on what that could possibly look like. So it could mean things like medication compression. It could mean that meals were simplified and all meals were served on disposable plates and dishes. It might mean that residents were only changed 1 time a day. It might mean that there weren't any tub baths, there were only sponge baths. So we implemented that when we needed to. And of course, we used overtime and agency staff. And I'm very proud of the fact that not once during this entire pandemic have we had to mandate nurses or healthcare aides, which I think is quite remarkable and is a great testament to how dedicated our staff are. We did have staff voluntarily cancel vacation. We did not cancel it for them, but they voluntarily canceled it so that they could be available to us. And I will say that we also had another test here in Manitoba back in April where we were supposed to be getting the snowstorm of the century, and we had to prepare for that. So not just dealing with all the COVID stuff, but the snowstorm as well. And it was amazing because we had, I think, 9 staff call in sick for evening shift. 20 staff volunteered to stay, and 12 of them actually slept over to make sure that we would have enough staff for the next day. So even though staff are tired, they are still very dedicated and wanting to help. And one of the other interesting outcomes from that snowstorm is there was a lot of media attention, and I'm usually the person that the media speaks with, but we also engage staff because the media was really interested in wanting to know why staff decided to stay. And I had 3 staff step forward. One of them, English was her second language. She worked in housekeeping, but she was just so proud and really knew what she wanted to share with people as to why she stayed over. Next slide, please. So designated caregivers are probably called something different in every province, but here in Manitoba, all people in personal care homes are allowed to pick 2 people that are able to assist them more intimately with care. And sometimes that might be a family member, sometimes it's a paid companion. In the case of the Simpkins Center, that happens quite often, actually. So for the longest time, there was no entry into the building at all, and that was mandated by the government. We, like I'm sure a lot of you, were resorting to window visits, to FaceTimes, then it progressed to outdoor visits, and then finally to allowing the 2 designated caregivers into the building. And the first reaction when you get into a critical situation sometimes with COVID is that you would think that you're just going to stop all visitors. Well, we really, because of the staffing difficulties, had to really rethink that. And we had to weigh the benefits versus the risk. And we decided very quickly in our first outbreak that we must let designated caregivers come back in. We needed to train them on how to assist with meals and how to use PPE. They needed to understand the risks of being here. And they actually were a very great help to us. And there has been no other time in the pandemic where we have not allowed them in. They are always welcome here. They are welcome to help. And I do believe that one of the unfortunate things about this pandemic is that our residents are very lonely. And I do believe that loneliness can kill people just as much as COVID can. And this has caused a lot of moral and ethical journey for myself, and I'm sure a lot of my colleagues as well, because it was incredibly sad when we were not able to let families be together. Next slide, please. So when we had our first outbreak, the other thing that we were definitely faced with critical staffing shortages, and we thought, who else can help us? So we did put a call out for volunteers. We put it on our Facebook page, we put it on our family email, we put it on our website, and the media picked it up. And as soon as the media picked it up, it brought a lot of attention to us, and we actually had so many people step forward. It was overwhelming. We have to actually say we're not accepting any more applications for volunteers. So it was really amazing, the response that we got. We made sure that people were aware of the risks. We provided them training with meal assistance and the use of PPE. And we certainly offered a variety of opportunities where people could help. So it might be meal assist, it might be the screening of staff, it might be making isolation gowns. So we actually, and you'll see the picture there of someone holding a yellow isolation gown. We actually had a Hutterite colony step forward to say, we know there's a shortage of isolation gowns, we can make them for you. So we were able to get the patterns and the specifications on the material. And the Hutterite colony, who are expert sewers, actually sewed, I think, a couple thousand yellow isolation gowns for us. So that was a pretty amazing gift. We had volunteers to put up our Christmas tree. Folding the isolation gowns is also a very big job, so we had volunteer folders. We had volunteers assisting with FaceTime and the Hutterite colony. So not only are they experts in sewing, they're also experts in cooking. And they offered, if in need, and we had a lot of sick staff in the kitchen, that they would take over our kitchen. And that thankfully didn't happen, but it was nice to know that we would have someone that could help us. Next slide, please. The other group of people that were great help to us were students. So we did not at any point say students couldn't be a part of our, they couldn't have their placements here. So we did have a variety of educational institutions, whether it was nursing, healthcare aides, social worker, rehab attendants, even an art therapist that came and did their practicums here, and they for sure were helping hands. But I think these are our next generation of workers in healthcare. They need to know how to work in a pandemic. So it was definitely the right thing to do. We also apply for several grants for summer students. So this could be through the provincial government, the green team, so people to help outdoors. but also through the Government of Canada Summer Jobs Grant for students. And I think last summer we had upwards of 15 students, and they did everything from meal assist to assisting with recreation, to assisting with the FaceTime, to assisting with transporting residents to visits outside. We had music students that played music for residents in a variety of areas. We had a student that worked with a rehab department to have a stationary bike program. So again, it just added to what we were able to do during a very difficult time. Next slide, please. So we also made sure that we took time to celebrate, and this meant a lot of different things, but two of the things, or three of the things that stuck out in my mind were our recovery parades. So we wanted to do something special when residents recovered from COVID and returned from the COVID isolation unit to their home unit. So we came up with the idea of a recovery parade. And the first resident that recovered, we asked her, what song do you want to play? And she said, Staying Alive by the Bee Gees. And she wanted a shirt, a t-shirt made that said Virus Survivor. And we said, absolutely, we can do that. So that's how our recovery parades were born, and the song stuck, and everybody that recovered and had a parade got a t-shirt as well. And it was the most uplifting, wonderful thing we could have done for staff, for residents, for families, for the community, and even the general public. This caught a lot of attention in the media. A lot of the local media picked it up, but so did the CBC National, and it ended up being one of the good news stories of the week on the CBC National. And then I was so proud to see that it was also one of the good news stories of the year. So we are incredibly proud of that. We also did, as a fun thing, myself and the fundraiser here made, and you'll see the picture there, COVID pinatas, and that was our We Beat COVID activity where people could beat the COVID pinata. So that was lots of fun. The other thing that I will comment on, and I wouldn't call it a celebration, but definitely a way to remember, show respect, gather together, is that we did do memorials for residents that passed away from COVID. The first one we did, it was a small number of staff, and we weren't able to invite families at that time, but we felt it was really important that our staff be able to have some closure, because this has been incredibly hard on them when you're losing members of our community. So that was well received, but we always knew that we wanted to do something bigger and better and be able to invite families back. So last fall, we actually were able to do that. We had a permanent COVID memorial made. It's a beautiful stone that sits in front of our building, and we invited families back. We, as many staff as wanted to, could participate. We had a rabbi here, we had spiritual care participating, and it was just a really beautiful way to recognize our residents, the hard work of staff, be able to connect with families and show them our condolences, because we weren't able to do that in the way we would have liked when their person passed away. Next slide, please. So we did a lot of staff appreciation, and every time that we did it, we always include all three shifts, which is really important, because typically a lot of the recognition and appreciation goes to day shift. We always had something for evenings and nights as well. And we were really lucky that we were able to do this because we had support, financial support from our families, from our generous community, and our own foundation. We also used our social media as much as we could to make sure that staff were acknowledged and thanked. And through COVID, there's also been a lot of media attention. And once you kind of get on the media list and agree to do one interview, they call you all the time. And that typically wouldn't be something that I would want to do, but during the pandemic, we used it to our best advantage. And it was a very good way to make sure that we were thanking staff and our families and our community. Next slide, please. So this is another, I'm not sure if other provinces have this, but the Winnipeg Jets have, where you can nominate healthcare people to be healthcare heroes. So we did nominate our COVID isolation unit staff, and they were selected, and this picture was put up on the Jets media, and I think it was also shown at a Jets game. So it was a really great way to recognize our staff. And they were the last group that were paraded out of the COVID isolation unit after our last resident went there and that, or left there, and that would be the bottom picture that you see there. Next slide, please. So as part of my reflection, I always like to think of silver linings. So for our site, this has meant increased morale and commitment to our residents in the organization. It has meant that we're an employer of choice, and we have now applied to be a top employer in Canada / Manitoba. I'm not sure if we'll be selected, but definitely something we hope that we'll get selected for. We have few vacant positions. We've actually, because we've been so transparent with everything, we have increased trust and support from our families. We have an improved profile in our faith and culture community. We have an increased public profile. Gifts to our foundation have increased. And unfortunately, it took thousands of residents across Canada dying, but finally, long-term care is getting the attention that it deserves and that we've been asking for so long. So that ends my presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Lori. And there's so many inspirational thank yous and comments in the chat related to your presentation, as well as lots of questions. So maybe we'll move on to the questions for Michelle and Deborah, yes, first, and then we will work our way through the questions for Lori. So first question about the staffing framework is your funding from the province adjusted by the number of beds that are occupied? So can you please explain how that works? I don't know who wants to go first.
Deb, how about you answer that?
There's two answers. So initially with COVID, some facilities had closed their beds so that they could accommodate if they did have an outbreak. And so the government did cut funding to some of those facilities because the beds were closed for that reason. When it came around to closing beds because of staffing, which was a little bit kind of later in the process of the pandemic, to my knowledge, Michelle, you may know differently, the government did not adjust any of the funding to any of the facilities that had to close beds.
That's correct. They were hopeful that it would be very short term. And as many administrators shared with the government, the infrastructure costs remain the same. Those are fixed costs. And there's this flow of staff off in isolation, could be back 5 days later. And so it was a very, uncertain time. And so that was the decision that was made.
The understanding was, even if there's a vacancy on the floor, you may be paying for that shift. Somebody's off on a leave, being paid for sick leave, or you're covering it in overtime costs.
Thank you. The next question is, with your mitigation strategies that were part of your framework, did you measure staff satisfaction with those strategies?
Some facilities might have individually, but certainly as a sector, Michelle, we haven't done anything to that extent at this point.
Great. And also just a call out for anyone to share recruitment strategies in the chat would be much appreciated. And then the final question is, are you able to share your framework?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we can either facilitate that or connect you, Michelle and Deborah. So thank you so much for sharing that framework. So now over to Lori. Lots of questions in the chat for you as well. So the first one, actually going back to one of your early slides, is, did using other disciplines, for example, non-unionized employees, cause any issues with unions?
Absolutely not. Our staff absolutely appreciated all the help, and there were no issues with unions.
Great. And did you use a specific training program to train staff to assist with meals and feeding?
It would be our homegrown program, and we liked to deliver it in person as much as we could, but it was also available as a PowerPoint and video, etc., if we needed to do that as well. So I can certainly share some of that if anybody is interested.
Great. Another question is, how did you get approval from your health authority for volunteers during the pandemic? Many had to discontinue use of volunteers during the majority of the pandemic due to concerns about transmission of the virus.
The health region was supportive and encouraging of doing this. And I know we were probably one of the first homes, if not the first home, to move forward with this, because I think people felt it was really risky, and in our mind, the benefits totally outweighed the risks. And I didn't believe, and still don't believe, that they're any more of a danger to our residents than any of our staff if we're able to train them properly with the use of PPE.
And building on the volunteer question, was vaccination mandatory for volunteers? Because many lost volunteers due to that requirement.
It was mandatory, and we did lose at least one really good volunteer, which is unfortunate, but was definitely necessary at the time.
Great. And a question, I guess, for all of you. So I'll ask Deborah and Michelle to pop back on, but I'll ask Lori first. Did Manitoba, for you, Lori, receive funding per resident day to offset COVID-related expenses?
I think every province did it a little bit differently, and ours wasn't based on per resident day. We were asked to keep track of COVID costs and then submit it. And to date, most things have been funded, but it was really unclear for a long period of time if it was going to be funded, if it was going to be reviewed later and money taken back, and that hasn't happened to date. But it was very clear right from the beginning in my mind that this wasn't about saving money. And as an organization, we were going to spend what we had to spend to make sure our staff and residents were safe. And if I had to go to our community and do fundraising to be able to pay for that, I was absolutely prepared to do that.
And Michelle and Deborah, can you comment on the Nova Scotia experience, please?
Sure. Throughout the pandemic, there were opportunities, and keep in mind, we had a new government that was just voted in power. And so there were definitely times throughout the pandemic where funding was made available for long-term care assistance, for instance, that it was extended beyond a 6-month period, where these were individuals that were not certified, that were, maybe within the facility, who could come in and support the workforce pressure. So that funding, was part of a bigger package. But like, other jurisdictions, federal funding came to support the infection prevention and control measures that were being implemented as part of the pandemic funding. Deb, you can speak to a few more, I'm sure. Oh, we lost you. Oh.
Looks like Deborah's having issues with audio. You want to try again?
I'm back, I think.
There you go. Yes.
I have never seen more money flow through long-term care. It's unbelievable. There's almost too much to even know what to do with it, or to be able to efficiently and effectively use all of it. Some of it was a per diem, per resident per day. Some of it was ad hoc. If you could make the argument that you needed it, you could get it. So there was a little bit of everything. And, fortunately, we still see some of that money coming in, at least for another 6 months or so. The challenge will be when it does dry up. What does that actually look like at the end of the day? And do we get to keep some of the, the IPAC resources that we've received, the additional funding for staffing that we've received?
Maybe the final question, I think, is the last one I can sneak in. So Michelle and Deborah, did you have the single site mandate as well in your province? And then over to you again, Lori, for the same question.
I think we did in the first wave 1 and wave 2, Deb.
Yeah, we did. And in the 5 and 6 that we're in now, it's been relaxed a little bit, but definitely it was there at the start.
So in Manitoba, definitely we had the single site staffing order. I think it was implemented on May 1st, 2020. It is still in place as of today, but it's been loosened up a little bit. And if staff are vaccinated, they're able to work in more than one site with permission.
Thank you to the three of you for sharing your experiences with us today. We truly appreciate sharing the creative work that's happening in long-term care. As you can see, it generated a lot of discussion today, so thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for joining us today. So please mark your calendar for our next webinar series, our next webinar, which will be taking place on June 13th at 12 Eastern Time, so topic coming soon. And as always, we appreciate your feedback in ensuring that the information that we're sharing is meeting your needs. So please take a minute to respond to our polling questions on how useful the information was, and if you're going to be sharing with others. And once again, I'd like to thank Michelle Lowe, Deborah Boudreau, and Laura Cerquetti for their excellent presentations today, and of course for everyone for joining us. So thank you so much and have a good day, everybody.